I don't know if you can hear me. I think, yeah, it seems to work. So, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Luc Leboeuf, and I'm the coordinator of the VULNER project. It's a real pleasure for me to welcome you here. I'm very happy that you've made the way to this conference room. I just very quickly give the floor to Dr. Miguel Lehmann, who's head of department within the Ministry of Science and Education of Saxony-Anhalt. The land of Saxony-Anhalt is hosting us today, and they're letting us use their room freely, so I thank them very much for that. And I'm very happy to give the floor to Dr. Lehmann from the Ministry of Saxony-Anhalt.
Dear Professor Foblets, dear Dr. Leboeuf, dear Dr. Edel, dear members of the project consortium, dear guests. First of all, I would like to deliver to you the best regards of our State Secretary, Thomas Wünsch, whose plans changed or were changed last minute, so that I am welcoming you today on this behalf. Especially for me, it is a pity not to be with you in Brussels. Almost exactly 5 years ago, on the 7th June of 2018, the representation of Saxony-Anhalt to the European Union hosted an event about research and policy agendas on international migration. One of the participating institutes was the Max Planck Institute for Social Anthropology, one of the world's leading research centers in the field. Professor Schlee, a former director, presented his research on causes of migration from rural areas of Sudan and Kenya, and Dr. Götze gave an overview of the various options for action for states in the first fight against terrorism and addressed the question whether it be possible to negotiate with terrorists. Back in 2018, there were almost 71 million forcibly displaced people worldwide, according to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. Wars and armed conflicts, political persecution and discrimination based on sexuality or religious affiliation, as well as poverty and the consequences of climate change, force people to leave their homes. In preparation for the event today, I revisited the official statistics. For the full picture for the last year, it is yet to be established. UNHCR estimates that global forced displacement has reached over 100 million at mid-2022. The final conference of the project VULNER, Vulnerabilities under the Global Protection Regime, will give us some insights into the work of Max Planck Institute for Social Anthropology and its international project partners from Canada, Rwanda, South Africa, and Lebanon. As the leading question, how does the law assess, address, shape, and produce the vulnerabilities of the protection seeker? As this leading question implies, VULNER deals in particular with the legal aspects surrounding the need for protection of migrants. Who should be considered particularly in need of protection and why? Which areas show a need for urgent action, especially at the international level beyond the European Union? In view of ongoing international conflicts and the already noticeable consequences of climate change, the issues of flight and migration represent one of the major challenges of the 21st century. The project VULNER is dedicated to issues that will become even more pressing in the coming years. And as the numbers I have just cited indicate, the project results could not be more relevant, far beyond being merely academic. Recently, the consortium published a discussion paper with the 10 most important messages and conclusions from the research works as a policy briefing. So that the research results can serve as a scientific basis for political decision makers. Last but not least, VULNER is also a great example for the close and successful cooperation of a non-university research institute like the Max Planck Institute for Social Anthropology, with its neighboring university, in this case the Martin Luther Universität of Halle-Wittenberg. This ongoing cooperation is also reflected in the draft for the Cluster of Excellence New Global Dynamics World next place. You will also enjoy your stay in Brussels. Good luck.
Dear Dr. Lehmann, Honourable Member of the European Parliament, Saskia Brikmont, dear Marie-Claire Foblets, dear Luc Leboeuf, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. It's my very pleasure to welcome you as a member of the consortium of the VULNER project. I'm Andreas Edel, I'm the Executive Secretary of Population Europe, a network of 36 leading demographic research centers throughout Europe. We were in charge, particularly for the policy dialogue and dissemination activities within the project. It might perhaps surprise you that someone who works in the field of population studies and at the science policy interface is approaching you at the first place. But it makes sense for many reasons. Let me just mention a few. One of the strong competitive advantages of the VULNER project was a strong interdisciplinary basis. And you will hear more about this in a minute by the next speakers. Particularly, the collaboration between lawyers and social scientists turned out as an extremely fruitful feature of the project. It would be highly desirable if such collaborations would be encouraged also in the future, as we need to better understand societal frameworks, population trends, and individual life course decisions for more evidence-informed and better targeted laws, legal practices, and policies. Even more so, as laws translate policies into practice, following common standards of justice. And policies matter a lot for population developments, at the macro as well as at the individual levels. But this mechanism works also vice versa. Population changes, such as those caused by migration, define the scope of policies which they have to be designed for. So it's important to study the intertwining of the law, legal practices, societal trends, their political framing, and the underlying population developments. In the case of VULNER, the VULNER project, this referred to a population which belongs to the most vulnerable amongst us, namely those refugees and migrants with their dangerous and depriving journey arrive in Europe with often traumatic experiences, thus need special protection within the asylum procedures, but also attention and care after arrival in the countries of destination. This highlights again the need of interdisciplinary collaboration between lawyers and social scientists, which by no means is usual, thus highly innovative. And it's important as it helps us to tailor better policies for the future. A future ahead of us, maybe even ahead of us very soon, given that migration from war and disaster zones all over the world will most presumably increase over the next decades. Also, the recent debate about a reform of the asylum procedures at the borders. Actually, the ministers of the interior of the EU member states are negotiating right now, while we meet here, shows how urgently we need this knowledge, particularly if the idea behind is to complete these procedures more quickly and efficiently. This knowledge creation requires not only overcoming disciplinary boundaries, but also a transdisciplinary dialogue, which means bringing together experts from politics, civil society, and science, and most importantly, the perspective of those affected. Here is to be mentioned that our view was not Eurocentric, but also included the experience in Uganda, Lebanon, and Canada. We think and hope you will share this view after the conference and your reading of the discussion paper that VULNER has achieved this ambition. During the next 2 days, you will have the opportunity to discuss with a number of highly eminent speakers and decision makers. But let me mention some people here in the room who deserve most credits for the great success of the VULNER projects, and I apologize in advance if I cannot mention all of them, given the short period of time for my speech. Most of all, I would like to thank the project coordinator of VULNER, Luc Leboeuf, who did an outstanding job throughout the project, from the first sketch of the proposal to the project's thanks, to the project's late outputs, to keep us all together with a great team spirit, to pursue this project in a very productive way, and always in a very pleasant and courteous style of cooperation. I would like to thank him also representing the other consortium partners, contributors, and authors of the VULNER project. Second, I would like to thank the European Commission for generously funding the VULNER projects and the project officers for their engagement, support, and advice. Third, I would like to thank the federal state of Saxony-Anhalt, and particularly the colleagues of its representation in Brussels for the great hospitality and support in making this event happen. Finally, let me also thank those who did a great job in the final period of the project to compile its results into a discussion paper and to organize the conference, my two colleagues, Kate Dearden and Peter Weissenburger. So now I can skip my last sentence. Before I had to hand over now to Marie-Claire Foblets, please join me in a warm applause for those people mentioned here. It's more than well-deserved. Thank you for your attention. Still, we can do it. So, warm applause. Marie-Claire.
Well, I think I join Andreas in the gratefulness to all the people who made it possible. And here is the principal responsible person who makes us really think together. And I would like to just address a very kind of small aspect of this broad picture. And it is the question how we scientists, researchers can contribute to addressing major issues, and I will do it from the point of view of the responsibility I'm taking in Germany for my department, Law and Anthropology, and being so happy that we could host and support and encourage Luc all these years, because I'm really grateful for having these projects in a research program that is really looking at the very question, how can anthropology play a role, when it comes to address major legal questions? And so I'll focus on these methodological questions, and I hope I won't be too academic, but I'll just say a few words. I'm speaking from the point of view of anthropologists, which does not mean that I do injustice to other social sciences, but I have no legitimacy. I'm just a qualitative researcher, I'm just an anthropologist, I'm not a sociologist, so I really want to insist that I feel only legitimate to speak from the point of view of anthropology. Now, what is anthropology and how can we relate anthropology to law? I think there are different ways to relate these two disciplines. We can look at how anthropologists try to understand law, and I will come back to this. And this is a very valid approach. They look at law in a very specific way. The other way around is how can anthropology play a role in legal thinking? And this comes close to what we are doing here. How can social sciences contribute to a better decision-making when it comes to address legal questions? And then we come really in this kind of ever more interconnected world, and anthropology defining itself as the expertise when it comes to diversity. Yeah? Can we contribute to addressing major issues that come with this interconnectedness in today's world? This brings me to a very critical issue in anthropology. Not everybody will just join me in this conviction that there is a knowledge that we can make available. Yeah? For some people, there are too many risks in applying anthropology because it comes with the risk of a reduction. It comes with the risk of essentialization. It comes with the risk of participating in a political agenda without you having any possibility to just correct. It can go in the wrong direction. Yeah? Your data are very vulnerable, yeah? Because you never know on which table they will land. And for some people having had mixed experiences with this, it's a no-go. And say we are just, not just, but we are doing the understanding thing. We are not participating in decision-making. So that's a position, a very valid position. In this case, my department very much stays for whenever we can, why not give it a try? Yeah? And it can also be linked with very different issues, not only migration, but environmental issues, detrimental environmental issues, impact assessment, health issues. Anthropologists are so close to these worlds, yeah, that their data might be extremely precious when it comes to deal with this data at the level of decision-making. But again, it's a position that my department is taking, and it's the reason why I'm so proud that we can from time to time support major projects like the one that is VULNER. The perspective of law in anthropology is a very interesting perspective. How do anthropologists look at law? They look at law with a stand that is on and in itself not normative. The anthropologist in first instance tries to understand what makes for people rules they feel they should abide by, what makes binding, yeah, regulation to people. And to understand this, the anthropologists start with a very innocent, we call it the innocent anthropologist, I don't know. I will have to learn from the field, yeah, what matters to people. I will have to have them tell me how they feel about, in this case, being vulnerable. Yeah? What does the term mean to these people? How do they experience their reality? And that is what you do through staying with the people. You're never coming up with representative data. We never pretend to be representative, but we do this qualitative, in-depth kind of exploration of a variety of worlds. We stay with the people, we try to get the closest possible to these people. If I mention the colonial heritage, it's because it began under colonial administration, even if today, when you read the writings of the first anthropologists, you find it frighteningly Eurocentric. Yeah? And there is always this very difficult epistemological question, how close can you come while not being a member of the community? So this kind of extremely ambitious desire to understand, whereas you all so have to stay very modest because you will never completely understand. So this kind of, and I think this is what makes anthropology probably, when it comes to these legal issues we are addressing, having its own added value. You speak the voice of the people who will not speak themselves when it comes to take decisions about these people. So this kind of being the broker, the very difficult position of being a broker. Some anthropologists will say, I'm not going for this because I don't feel I represent enough. I don't have the legitimacy. Other anthropologists will tell you, if I don't do it, who will do it? Yeah? These kind of ethical dilemmas. What am I doing with my data? And some anthropologists say, if I'm not doing anything with my data, I do not deserve to be the scholar I want to be. So it's the whole question of the engagement, the commitment of anthropologists. So again, I say I can only speak for a position that I think I'm convinced is a position that is a valid one, but I cannot speak for all anthropologists in the room or outside of this room. Yeah? This brings me then to application of anthropologists in the knowledge they have and to share it with people who have to take decisions. As I said, there is no consensus. Anthropologists have mixed feelings. They feel there is a lot of culturalization, essentialization, reduction ongoing. Some will also say it's the other way around. There are also sometimes reservations on the side of the decision makers who say, but yes, but if anthropologists among them disagree, who should I then follow? If it's only qualitative, then it's not really scientific. If it's only from hearsay, then I don't have the evidence I need for my decision making. So, and also anthropologists have a tendency to complexify because they put everything in the context. And for a decision maker, it makes it even more complex. Yeah? So this kind of exercise that comes down to contextualization to the extreme, because every single situation is a single situation, makes it for some decision makers very difficult to really go for this kind of helping anthropologists in taking decisions. No? So there is this kind of reservations on both sides. And when I then really think of VULNER, yeah, if you go to a kind of application of anthropological knowledge about the worlds of these people that are the concern of VULNER. Vulnerability is not a neutral concept. It's very normative. Yeah? There is an appreciation in it. And what anthropologists do is they take the stand of the people. And sometimes people will feel very different about vulnerability than the legal documents. And so you have this kind of gap. And I think this is the major work that you have been doing, Luc. It's document this gap. And what decisions makers will do with your fantastic research. I mean, now the challenge is on their side. Of course, what you can still do for the years to come is try to have this document on the table of the decision makers at the right moment. But again, I think it's a very brave project, VULNER. First, because not everybody goes for this kind of application of knowledge. Second, it forces you to really go in a direction of another responsibility. It's the people that deal with vulnerability from the point of view of the selection, from the point of view of the prioritization. And sometimes anthropologists will be very disappointed about what will be done with the research they are coming up with. But that would be my wish for you, that it will land on the right table of the right people with the right heart and that know how to deal with the complexity of all the data that we will discuss the coming hours and tomorrow. Luc, thank you so much for having done this.
On time. Well. All right, thank you very much. Thank you very much also, Marie-Claire and Andreas, for the very kind words. And I'm thanking you on behalf of the whole consortium and the consortium members, because our project is a project that was collaborative in nature. And what I will do in my presentation is just to sketch very briefly the overall framework within which each partner developed their own research, knowing, of course, that this is a very broad framework that allowed for collaboration and for discussion exchanges within the consortium. And I'll then seize the opportunity of that presentation to reflect a bit on this very notion of vulnerability and on the different way we encountered that notion in our project and the different way in which each partner dealt with that notion as well within our project. So first, very briefly, what's the VULNER project? Well, as you've heard already, it's an EU Horizon 2020 project that involves 9 research institutions, including research institutions from Canada that were led by Delphine Nakache and that were financed by a matching funding of the Canadian Research Council. So thank you very much to all the partners, including the Canadian partners, for having flew all the way to Brussels for this final event. We're very happy to have you among us. 41 scientists worked as part of the project, took their own angle to it, developed their own research within this collaborative framework. They worked in research fields that were located in very different countries and that involve very different contexts, including northern context, and I'm speaking here of Europe, of course, but also Canada, as well as a southern context. And the reason why we wanted to have also research in Uganda and in Lebanon was to reflect a bit still on this notion of vulnerability that has actually a long story and a long history of being developed as part of humanitarian programming in the Global South. So we wanted to reflect on what happens in our countries in Europe with vulnerability, knowing that there is some lessons to be learned on how it has been developed in other countries such as Lebanon and Uganda, and as well as Canada, where it's far from being a new trend. Our project started from a common observation, which we decided to tackle through a very broad but still common methodological approach. The common observation that guided us and that led us into this project was that there are a lot of talks nowadays about vulnerability, about the need to protect the most vulnerable asylum seekers, refugees, and migrants, but there is absolutely no consensus of who is vulnerable. Besides, we also noticed, based on the focus group discussion we had with civil society organizations when preparing the project application, that there is a lot of concern among the civil society organization because they feel that maybe vulnerability also has the effect of downplaying rights to the most vulnerable. And we started with these questions, with this concern, which we decided to investigate while combining the analysis of the legal framework with the study of its implementation by the decision makers, by state actors on the ground, which we then confronted to the experiences of the migrants themselves. So the objective was really to combine the study of how states understand vulnerability, how they apply it in different contexts, and to then confront that with the experiences that migrants have of their own vulnerability so that we could identify mismatches and we could identify also ways of improvement in state approaches to migrants' vulnerability. Now, what does this kind of research allows us to say on the very concept of vulnerability itself? Well, you'll hear talking about that a lot during the next 2 days. And what I want to do here is simply to maybe take a step back on the various research results that will be presented by reflecting on how vulnerability is itself a notion that has come to acquire different meanings and different functions depending on the frameworks within which it is used and mobilized. And what I mean by this is that in our project we encountered a vulnerability as a concept with very different meanings, very different functions that need to be considered if you want to think properly about this research question which we had and that guided us, which are: what is vulnerability? How can it help us when we're thinking about asylum and migration governance? And to do that, I'll mobilize Mick theory on traveling concept. What is that theory? Well, in her work on interdisciplinary work, Mick came up with the argument that we need to give particular attention to how concepts can receive different meanings depending on the frameworks within which they're being used and invoked. And she says, quite often these meanings are implied. So we use the word, and sometimes we speak about something completely different, but we don't realize it, because these meanings are implied and they go with the framework within which the concept is being used and mobilized. And why is it important to have a reflection about this? Simply because concepts are not neutral, of course. They have an influence on the reality they seek to represent, and I think Marie-Claire hinted at that in a speech as well. When you use vulnerability, you're already taking a kind of certain stance that will vary depending on the framework, but that is still there and that will impact the state action, or that will impact the kind of position you have and the kind of research results you come up with as a researcher. And I think this kind of reflection is even more important to have when you see a concept such as vulnerability transforming itself as a concept that guides state action, since this is nowadays the very objective that is being stated in the public discourse on asylum and migration. The many travels of vulnerability which we encountered throughout the project mainly concern three spheres. The first one is the moral framework. So vulnerability has been developed as a moral concept within a particular philosophy or within a particular school of thought, which is the ethics of care, that mobilize vulnerability with the view to advocate for a just society. Vulnerability has also been developed as a heuristic concept with a view to better understand human experiences. What are the life of people? What do they experience? What are their daily difficulties? What are their life challenges? And finally, more and more, we see vulnerability being developed as a legal and bureaucratic concept, which is there to guide state action. And all these different frameworks within which vulnerability is developing itself, of course, interact with each other. And as vulnerability travels from one framework to the other one, it also takes with it its implied meanings, leading to further difficulties in these other frameworks. So I realize this is all very abstract, so let me now zoom in into each of these frameworks to emphasize the main findings and implied meanings that vulnerability has within this framework. So let's first take the moral framework, where vulnerability has been developed as a way to support a specific theory of justice. Vulnerability has been theorized in the ethics of care as a concept that allows to advocate for a more fair, for a more just society, that allows to guide state action towards protecting the weakest member of a society. So that's one way of looking at vulnerability. It's something that allows you to say it is fair, it is just to act when you see that someone is in a vulnerable position, when you see that someone is weak within a society. That's the first understanding of vulnerability. Now, of course, that understanding of vulnerability has itself a lot of implied meanings that we will see popping up again in the other frameworks within which vulnerability is used. The first one is that it's very much focused on individuals. So in vulnerability theory, the center of attention are individuals, which can lead to further issues when you want to use a vulnerability, because it means that you might lose sight of the broader structure, that you might lose sight of the broader framework, of the broader social setting, which have the consequence of putting individuals in a vulnerable position. So there is a lot of emphasis within vulnerability theories on the need to empower individuals so that they can lead their own self-independent life. But sometimes, for some individuals, they're put in such a vulnerable position, of course, that it is actually not possible. Another implied meaning of vulnerability, and that goes along with the concept when it travels to other frameworks, is its very strong gender dimension. So vulnerability theories are often considered as feminist ethics. They have a strong attention to the gender dimension within society that can lead to inequalities. Of course, such attention is deserved, but it also implies that when vulnerability is invoked in other framework, for example in law, we have always this particular outlook on the gender dimensions of vulnerabilities. When you look at the vulnerability categories as they exist nowadays, for example, in humanitarian programming or as part of EU asylum law, there is a strong attention to the specific needs of vulnerable women, of gender and sexual minorities, etc. Doesn't mean it's problematic, but it's simply something that needs to be known and acknowledged when you address this concept of vulnerability. Moving on to the other framework, vulnerability as a heuristic device. When you use vulnerability as a heuristic device, it means that you're doing something completely different. It means that you're not advocating for a better society, but you're rather trying to take some kind of action by looking at the life of people and identifying where the vulnerabilities are, where the difficulties are. There is a lot of research that has been done with that, and there is a lot of research that has been done within our project as well. Social scientists have used vulnerability in view to understand the difficulties that are faced by some disadvantaged group and people, such as asylum seekers. It's also been used in humanitarian programming for a long time, where vulnerability is used by aid agencies in view of identifying who will need some kind of state support. This kind of approach to vulnerability, again, implies that you take away with it some implied meanings that lead in turn to some theoretical and practical challenges. The first practical challenge that arise very quickly, and that is intrinsically linked with how vulnerability has been theorized in the moral framework, is that you have this focus on individuals. And I come back to this because that's something we wanted to show in our research, and I think everyone has showed in their research as part of a project. It's not all about individuals, of course. The pressure, the restrictions that individuals are facing also have much to do with the more structural factors. And when you have a look at the outputs of a project, that's something that has been tackled in various ways by all the researchers. It is to show how migration policies, how migration law can also have an impact on those vulnerabilities. Second element, which is linked with the concept itself, not so much because of how it is theorized in vulnerability theory, but rather because of how it is perceived in the public discourse, is that it's very difficult to move beyond an approach to vulnerability that links vulnerable people to victims. Vulnerability remains within the realm of affective communication. And as a result, it's very difficult to cut that from a perspective that will see vulnerable people as being completely passive. Now, I'm saying this as not coming from the moral framework, simply because in vulnerability theory, on the contrary, there is a lot of emphasis being put on how individuals can exercise their agency, how they can become very self-reliant when put in a position to do so. But the truth is that vulnerability remains an affective concept, and so when you move away from this theoretical discussion, that's how you get very much and very quickly into this kind of discourses that are victimizing discourse and that neglect people's ability at developing their own resistance strategies. Finally, a last difficulty that arises when you use vulnerability as a heuristic device, as a tool to document the experience of people, is that people don't label themselves as vulnerable. And I think that's something that came up a lot through the research based on the fieldwork that was done by all the researchers. People don't name themselves as vulnerable. They name themselves as vulnerable when they understand that the system requires them to do so. But when they speak about their life challenges, their life difficulties, they don't see themselves as weak, they don't see themselves as passive, because they're not, of course. And that's a difficulty, of course, that needs to be tackled when doing the research. You need to be able to make that translation between the life challenges that people are talking to you about and the theory on vulnerability. In the VULNER project, and I just refer you to the publications on our website and the various research reports that have been produced more specifically, we try to deal with this tension by including a focus not only on the personal circumstances, which can be of a corporeal nature, meaning, some disabilities that people have, the gender, etc., but which can also have to do with the social context. And we try to combine this, focus on the personal circumstances, with a study of the encounters with state actors, how they also lead to some vulnerabilities, as well as a study of the structural factors that can generate some vulnerabilities. And this all led to the policy recommendation that you can find in the discussion paper. Moreover, in view of avoiding that we fall into the trap of having really this approach that victimizes people, we combined vulnerability with other theoretical tools, which are first agency. Agency meaning the ability that people have of making their own independent life choices when put in a position to do so, of course, which we also combined with temporality to account for how vulnerability may evolve over time, and intersectionality, and Francesca Raimondo will have a lot to say about that in a much more precise way than I can do. Intersectionality, which was there to make sure that we don't focus on one specific factor of vulnerability at a time, but that we have a more all-encompassing angle. But again, Francesca will tell you a lot more about this. Finally, moving on to the last framework in which we encountered vulnerability within our project, which is the legal and bureaucratic framework. Well, there, the connection with vulnerability theories, the connection with vulnerability as a heuristic device, as a way to understand migrants' experiences, is much less straightforward. Because what we can see is that when vulnerability enters the legal and bureaucratic framework, it changes in function, it changes in nature. And basically, and I'm basing myself here on the study of EU law and the case law of the European Court of Human Rights, what we can see is that in law there are two main translations of vulnerability. The first one is a focus on specific needs, special needs. In Norway they speak of extra needs, so the way you name it and you label it can change a bit depending on the country. So that's the first approach, which comes down to breaking down vulnerability to criteria that are very easy to identify, that can be checked through a kind of checking list exercise. What's the gender of the person? Is it a single mother? Is that person pregnant? Etc., etc. It's an approach which, of course, has the advantage of giving clear guidelines to the public servant to ensure a kind of consistency of the practices. It can also help in some circumstances to indeed offer adequate support to the people who need it. But it's also an approach that leads to various implementation challenges that were documented throughout our project. And these challenges all resolve around the risk of developing a very sanitized approach to vulnerability, thinking that you can work through it with a simple checking list exercise. And I think that when you look at the discussion on what's happening nowadays regarding the border processes at the EU and the accelerated border process, you can see that risk popping up with the idea that has been expressed by some, which is not something, of course, to disregard at all, but which wouldn't be a comprehensive solution in itself, which is the idea to have some kind of vulnerability screening of the people who come at the border to see if they can go in the accelerated asylum process or not. Well, it can help, but it's illusory. It's an illusion, really, to believe that it will be a comprehensive solution, because you cannot address all vulnerabilities. You're addressing specific needs, and that's something else. Another approach to vulnerability, which we can find in the legal framework and which is closer to the approach of the European Court of Human Rights and of the Court of Justice of the European Union, as well as of some national courts that were studied by which case law was studied by the project members, is an approach that uses vulnerability as a very flexible tool to guide legal reasoning. And that's a different approach, which presents the advantage of flexibility, but at the same time, it's also very difficult to grasp. And why is that so? Because we can see when you look at the court rulings, and I've done that work for the jurisprudence and the case law of the European Court of Human Rights, there you see that vulnerability is once used without giving it specific meanings. You know, they say vulnerable like they will say a chair or table. And sometimes it seems to play a role in the reasoning. Sometimes that role can be clear, but that's the exception. Most of the time it's not clear at all. So it seems it's rather something that the judge or the public servants, when you're talking at when you're having a look at what happens at the operational level, takes into consideration when deciding, but you don't know how exactly and to what kind of decision this leads. And this, of course, leads to additional challenges. So I told you before that we have some implied meanings of vulnerability that resurface within each framework. But that there are also challenges that add up with each framework. And the challenges that add up within the bureaucratic and legal framework, when you use vulnerability essentially as a tool to identify the people who can get access to protection, are first, the fact that emotion and affect play a huge role. Vulnerability, again, is an affective notion, and this plays a role in the way public servants and judges understand vulnerability and apply it. That's not always negative. The public servants, judges are human, and the human factor is something important when the state is responding to difficult situations. It can also allow the state to show some flexibility by having individuals who can also express their emotion and adapt the rules when they see that it will be clearly unfair to treat certain people in a certain way. But still, it also raises the risk of having inconsistent practices. Another consequence of that is that vulnerability very quickly becomes a performance. And what I mean by that is that vulnerability becomes something that people need to perform if they want to be given access to certain rights and advantages. And of course, the more you restrict the rights and advantages, the more you limit them to vulnerable people, the more people will be requested to show that they are vulnerable if they want to have access to these rights and advantages. And this can lead to quite a lot of adverse effects, including a vulnerability competition that has been documented, for example, in Uganda, so in the most difficult context, in which people really need to show that they're more vulnerable than their neighbor if they want to survive, basically, and to get access to a bit of food to be able to make it through the day. On the maybe more positive side, it also becomes a tool that is seized sometimes by migrants and asylum seekers to resist the system. And it's something that, again, has been very well documented by Sophie Nakuera in her work in Uganda, where she showed how some refugee-led association use this label of vulnerability to go to the authorities and to say, well, please comply with the promises you're making towards vulnerable people, recognize that we are vulnerable in such way, and answer our vulnerability. So it can also be a tool for a kind of conversation with the authorities. Now, this was an helicopter view of the various meanings that vulnerability has received and that we have encountered throughout our project. I realize it's quite abstract, but I'm sure you'll understand more as long as we move on with these 2 days, with a lot of research that has been done by the partners, and that sometimes adds on this, and that sometimes also contradicts this, but that's part of being in a collaborative project. What I want to do here is simply maybe to come back to the mission we got when we got that funding. And that mission is always a bit tricky for scientists. That mission was to produce knowledge that can inform policy-making debates. So what can we say here, based on what I've said on these travels and transformation of vulnerability, on the promises and challenges of using and mobilizing vulnerability as a tool for EU asylum and migration governance? What can we say to the EU about this? Well, very briefly, the first main danger that exists with such approach is to fall into what I'd call the humanitarianism trap. And what do I mean by there? I mean that the risk is that we end up having an excessively moralized outlook on migrants' lives and on migrants' experiences. To the end, with the consequence that in the end we're only talking about deservingness. Who deserves to be protected? Who's weak enough to deserve protection? Whereas the conversation shouldn't be about deservingness. The conversation should be about rights. When talking about current discussion we see at the EU level, I think that the main question should be who is entitled to reception conditions and to what kind of reception condition. It shouldn't be who deserves to get access to reception condition. Same thing with the asylum process. What kind of process can be fair for everyone, not who deserves to get a fair process. So there is a need, I believe, to avoid falling into this trap of humanitarianism that leads us away to the question of what the rights are and how they are defined as well in international law. Moreover, I also believe that it can also lead to some kind of negative effect in the public discourse when you focus too much on deservingness and you lose track of this rights discourse and this rights-based discourse. And this risk is the fact that you turn a vulnerability and that you use it to focus a bit too much to frame migrants as passive and innocent victims. They're not passive and innocent victims. They must go through extremely dangerous journey to go to reach Europe. They're not passive and innocent victims. And when you do that, when you present them as passive to show how deserving they are of protection, then you fall into the trap of developing policies that fail on building up on their aspiration and on their agency. And I think a good example of that, which is also a risk that we see nowadays with current discussion at EU level, is that you end up devising solutions that have been developed as part of the humanitarian responses to crisis in the Global South, and that are a solution that are based on camps and that are based on encampment strategies. Now, does it mean that vulnerability is something that should be ditched, that vulnerability is bad, and that all these developments that we've seen in the past years that focus on vulnerable people are wrong and that we should give it up? I don't think so. I think that, to the contrary, if it is based on adequate understanding of the empirical research that has been done, including the research that has been done by the VULNER project, you can also use vulnerability as a tool to guide the operational practices. And that will be maybe my main message here to the EU policymakers. We've been talking a lot about legal harmonization at the EU level. We've been talking a lot about establishing common legislation so that we have common policies at the EU level. Maybe it's time to move beyond that question, to work on the implementation of the law, to work on the operationalization of the legal standards. And if you really want to have a common approach, you need to work on harmonizing the operational practices, on harmonizing the implementing practices. And that's where vulnerability might have a useful role to play by bringing the attention to the life experiences of the migrants and refugees who are seeking a protection in Europe. And if I have a hope, maybe, is that the EU Agency for Asylum will keep using vulnerability because they start working on it and they will develop these tools in a way that also consider empirical research that shows what the experiences of migrants are to further harmonize the practices at the member states level so that we finally have a more common asylum system which also rests on common implementation practices. And I'll stop here and I thank you very much for your attention.